Hello and welcome to the fifth reading of Coming Up for Air by George Orwell, narrated by H.R. Isaac. We begin at Chapter 5 of Section 2, or Part 2. Chapter 5, Fishing. Here I'll make a confession, or rather two. The first is that when I look back through my life, I can't honestly say that anything I've ever done has given me quite such a kick as fishing. Everything else has been a bit of a flop in comparison, even women. I don't set up to be one of those men that don't care about women. I spent plenty of time chasing them, and I would even now if I had the chance. Still, if you gave me the choice of having any woman you care to name, but I mean any woman, or catching a 10-pound carp, the carp will win every time. And the other confession is that after I was 16, I never fished again. Why? Because that's how things happen. Because it is life we lead. I don't mean human life in general. I mean life in the particular age and this particular country. We don't do anything we want to do. It isn't because we're always working. Even a farmhand or a Jew tailor isn't always working. It's because there's some devil in us that drives us to do to and fro on everlasting idiocies. There's time for everything except the things worth doing. Think of something you really care about. Then add hour to hour and calculate the fraction of your life that you've actually spent in doing it. And then calculate the time you spent on things like shaving, riding to and fro on buses, waiting in a railway junction, swapping dirty stories, and reading the newspapers. After I was 16, I didn't go fishing again. There never seemed to be time. I was at work, I was chasing girls, I was wearing my first button boots and my first high collars, and for the collars of 1909, you needed a neck like a giraffe. I was doing correspondence courses in salesmanship and accountancy and improving my mind. The great fish were gliding round in the pool behind Binfield House. Nobody knew about them except me. They were stored away in my mind. Someday, some bank holiday perhaps, I'd go back and catch them, but I never went back. There was time for everything except that. Curiously enough, the only time between then and now when I did very nearly go fishing was during the war. It was in autumn of 1916, just before I was wounded. We'd come out of the trenches to a village behind the line, and though it was only September, we were covered with mud from head to toe. As usual, we didn't know for certain how long we were going to stay there, or whether we were going afterwards. Luckily, the CO was a bit off color, a touch of bronchitis or something, and so didn't bother about driving us through the usual parades. Kit inspections, football matches, and so forth, which were supposed to keep up the spirits of the troops when they were out of the line. We spent the first day sprawling about on piles of chaff in the barns where we were bilted and scarping the mud off our puttees. And in the evening, some of the chaps started queuing up for couple of wrenched, worm-out whores who were established in house at the end of the village. In the morning, although it was against orders to leave the village, I managed to sneak off and wander round the ghastly desolation that had once been fields. It was a damp, wintry kind of morning. All round, of course, where the awful muck and litter of war, the sort of filthy, sordid mess that's actually worse than a battlefield of corpses. Trees with boughs torn off them, old shell holes and had partly filled up again, tin cans, turd, mud, weeds, clumps of rusty barbed wire with weeds growing through them. You knew the feeling you had when you came out of the line, a stiffened feeling in all your joints, and inside you a kind of emptiness, a feeling that you'd never again have any interest in anything. It was partly fear and exhaustion, but mainly boredom. At the time, no one saw any reason why the war shouldn't go on forever. Today or tomorrow or the day after, you were going back to the line, and maybe next week a shell would blow you to potted meat. But that wasn't so bad as the ghastly boredom of the war stretching out forever. I was wandering up the side of a hedge when I ran into a chap in our country whose surname I didn't remember, but who was nicknamed Nobby. He was a dark, slouching, gypsy-looking chap, a chap who even in uniform always gave the impression that he was carrying a couple of stolen rabbits. By trade he was a coaster, and he was a real Cockney, but one of those Cockneys that make part of their living by hop-picking, bird catching, poaching, and fruit stealing in Kent and Essex. He was great expert on dogs, ferrets, cage birds, fighting cocks, and the kind of things. As soon as he saw me, he beckoned to me with his head. He had a sly, vicious way of talking. "'Ere, George." The chap still called me George. I didn't go out fat in those days. "George, did you see the clumps of poplars across the field?" "Yes." "Well, there's a pool on the other side of it, and it's full of bleeding great fish." "Fish? Garn. I tell you it's bleeding full of 'em, Perch. They are. As fish as even I got my thumbs on. Come on, see for yourself." We trudged over the mud together. Sure enough, Nobby was right. On the other side of the poplars, there was a dirty-looking pool with sandy banks. Obviously, it had been a quarry and had gotten filled up with water, but it was swarming with perch. You could see their dark blue strippy back gliding everywhere, just under water, and some of them must have weighed a pound. I suppose in 2 years of war they hadn't been disturbed, and had time to multiply. Interesting. Probably you can't imagine what the sight of those perch had done to me. It was as though they'd suddenly brought me to life. Of course, there was only one thing in both our minds: how to get hold of a rod and line. "Christ," I said, "we'll have some of those." "You bet we frickin' will. Come on, back to the village and let's get hold of some tackle." "Okay, you want to watch out, though. If the sergeant gets to know, we'll cop it." "Oh, frick the sergeant. They can hang a door the quarter me if they want to. I'm going to have some of them bleeding fish. You can't know how wild we were to catch those fish. Or perhaps you can. If you ever been at war, you know the frantic boredom of war and the way you'll clutch to at almost any kind of amusement. I've seen 2 chaps in a dugout fight like devils over half a 3-penny magazine, but there was more to it than that. It was the thought of escaping, for perhaps a whole day, right out of the atmosphere of war, to be sitting under the poplar trees, fishing for perch, away from the company, away from the noise and the stink and the uniforms and the officers and the saluting and the sergeant's voice. Fishing is the opposite of war, but it wasn't at all certain that we were bringing it off. That was the thought that sent us into a kind of fever. If the sergeants found out, he'd stop us as sure as fate, and so would any of the officers. And the worst of all was that there was no knowing how long we were going to stay at the village. We might stay there a week. We might march off in 2 hours. Meanwhile, we had no fishing tackle of any kind, not even a pin or a bit of string. We had to start from scratch, and the pool was swarming with fish. The first thing was a rod. A willow wad is best, but of course that wasn't willow tree anywhere this side of the horizon. Nobby shinned off one of the poplars and cut off a small brow, which wasn't really good, but was better than nothing. He trimmed it down with his jackknife till it looked something like a fishing rod, and then we hid it in the weeds near the bank and managed to sneak back into the village without being seen. The next thing was needles to make a hook. Somebody had a needle. One chap had some darning needles, but they were too thick and had blunt ends. We daren't let anyone know that we wanted it for fear the sergeant should hear about it. At last, we thought of the whores at the end of the village. They were pretty sure to have needles. Then we got there. You have to go around to the back door through a mucky courtyard. The house was shut up and the whores were having a sleep, which they no doubt earned. We stamped and yelled and banged on the door until after 10 minutes a fat ugly woman in a wrapper came down and screamed at us in French. Nobody shouted at her, "Needle, needle, needle, you got a needle?" Of course, she didn't know what we were talking about. Then Nobby tried pidgin English, which he expected her as foreign to understand. "Wanty needle, siwi clothe, like a thesis." He made gestures which were supposed to represent sewing. The whore misunderstood him and opened the door a bit wider to let us in. Finally, we made her understand and got a needle from her. By this time, it was dinner time. After dinner, the sergeant came around the barn where we were biltered looking for men for a fatigue. We managed to dodge him just in time by getting under a pile of chaff. When he was gone, we got a candle alight, made the needle red hot, and managed to bend it into a kind of hook. We didn't have any tools except jackknives, and we burnt our fingers badly. The next thing was a line. Nobody had any string except thick stuff, but at last we came across a fellow who had a reel of sewing thread. He didn't want to part with it, and we had to give him a whole packet of fags for it. The thread was much too thin, but Nobby cut it into 3 lengths, tied them into a tail in the wall, and carefully plaited them. Meanwhile, after searching all over the village, I managed to find a cork, and I cut it in half and stuck a match through it and made a float. By this time, it was everything and getting on towards dark. By the time it was evening and getting on towards dark. We got the essentials now, but we could do with some gut. They didn't see much hope of getting any until we thought of the hospital orderly. Surgical gut wasn't part of his equipment, but it was just possible that he might have some. Sure enough, when we asked him, he found he had a whole hank of medical gut in his haversack. It had taken him fancy in some hospital or other, and he'd pinched it. We swapped another packet of fags for 10 lengths of gut. It was rotten, brittle stuff in pieces about 6 inches long. After dark, nobody soaked them until they were pliable and tied them end to end. So now we'd got everything: hook, rod, line, float, and gut. We could dig out worms anywhere, and the pool was swarming with fish, huge, great, stripy perch crying out to be caught. We lay down to kip in such a fever then that we didn't even take our boots off. Tomorrow, if we could just have tomorrow, if the war would forget about us for just a day. We made up our minds that as soon as roll call was over, we'd hook and stay away all day, even if they gave us field punishment. No, for it when we came back. Number 1 for it when we came back. Well, I expect you can guess the rest. At roll call, orders were to pack all kits and be ready to march in 20 minutes. We marched 9 miles down the road and then got on to lorries and were off to another part of the line. As for the pool under the poplar trees, I never saw or heard it again. I expect it got poisoned with mustard gas later on. Since then, I've never fished. I never seemed to get the chance. And there was the rest of the war. And then, like everyone else, I was fighting for a job. And then I'd got a job, and the job had got me. I was promising young fellow in an insurance office, one of those keep young businessmen with a firm jaw and good prospects that you used to read about in the Clark's College adverts. And then I was the usual downtrodden 5 to 10 pounds a weeker in a semi-tacked villa in the outer suburbs. Such people don't go fishing anymore. And then stockbrokers go out picking primroses. It wouldn't be suitable. Other recreations are provided for them. Of course, I have my fortnight's holidays every summer. You know the kind of holiday: Margate, Yarmouth, Eastbourne, Hastings, Bournemouth, Brighton. There's a slight variation across whoever or not were flush that year. With a woman like Hilda along, the chief feature of the holiday is endless mental arithmetic to decide how much the boarding house keeper is swindling you. That and telling the kids no, they can't have a new bucket. A few years back we were at Bournemouth. One fine afternoon we loitered down the pier, which must be about half a mile long, and all the way along it chaps were fishing with stumpy sea rods with little belts on the end and their lines stretching 50 yards out to sea. It's a dull kind of fishing, and they weren't catching anything. Still, they were fishing. The kids soon got bored and clamored to go back to the beach, and Hilda saw a chap sticking a lob worm on his hook and said it made her feel sick. But I kept loitering up and down for a little while longer, and suddenly there was a tremendous ringing from a bell, and a chap was winding in his line. Everyone stopped to watch, and sure enough, in it came, a wet line and the lumber of a lump of lead at the end, a great flash fish, a flounder, I think, dangling and wiggling. The chap dumped it on the plank of the pier, and it flapped up and down, and wet and gleaming, and its grey warty back and its white belly and fresh salty smell of the sea, and sometimes kind of moved inside me. As we move off, I said casually, just to test Hilda's reaction, I've half a mind to do a bit of fishing myself while we're here. What? You go fishing, George? But you don't even know how, do you? Oh, I used to be a great fisherman, I told her. She was vaguely against it, as usual, but didn't have any idea on one way or another, except that if I was fishing, she wasn't coming with me to watch me put those nasty squashy things on the hook. Then suddenly she got on to the fact that if I was going to go fishing, the set out that I'd need rod and reel and so forth would cost round about a quid. The rod alone would cost 10 bob. Instantly she flew into a temper. You haven't seen old Hilda when there's talk of wasting 10 bob, she burst out on me. You haven't seen old Hilda when there's talk of wasting 10 bob, she burst out at me. The idea of wasting all that money on a thing like that, absurd. And how they dare charge 10 shillings for one of those silly little fishing rods. It's disgraceful. And fancy you going fishing at your age. A great big grown-up man like you. Don't be such a baby, George. Then the kids got on it. Lorna sidled up to me and asked if the silly pert way she has. Are you a baby, Daddy? And little Billy, who at the time didn't speak quite plain, announced to the world in a general flavor, Farver's baby, in a general Farver's. Then suddenly they both were dancing around me, rattling their sand buckets and chanting, Farther's a baby, unnatural little bastards. Chapter 6. And besides fishing, there was reading. I've exaggerated it if I've given the impression that fishing was the only thing I cared about. Fishing certainly came first, but reading was a good second. I must have been either 10 or 11 when I started reading. Reading voluntarily, I mean. At the age, it's like discovering a new world. I'm a considerable reader right even now. In fact, there aren't many weekends in which I don't get through a couple of novels. I'm what you might call the typical Boots Library subscriber. I always fall for the bestseller of the month. The Good Companions, Bengal Lancer, Hatter's Castle. I fell for every one of them, and I've been a member of the Left Book Club for a year or more. And in 1918, when I was 25, I had a sort of debauch of reading and made a certain difference in my outlook. But nothing is even like those 5 years when you suddenly discover that you could open a penny weekly paper and plunge straight into thieves, kitchens, and Chinese opium dens, and Polynesian islands, and the forests of Brazil. It was from when I was 11 to when I was about 16 that I got my biggest kick out of reading. At first, it was always the boys' penny weeklies, little thin papers with vile print and an illusion and 3 colors on the cover, and a bit later it was books, Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Nicola, The Iron Pirate, Dracula, Raffles, and Nat Gold and Ranger Gold and Chap, whose name I forgot, who wrote boxing stories almost as rapidly as Nat Gold wrote racing ones. I suppose if my parents had been a little better educated, I'd have had good books shoved down my throat, Dickens and Thackeray and so forth, and in fact they did drive us through Quentin Durward at school, and Uncle Ezekiel sometimes tried to incite me to read Ruskin and Carlyle, but there were practically no books in our house. Father had never read a book in his life, except the Bible and Smiles' Self-Help, and didn't of my own accord read a good book till much later. I'm not sorry it happened that way. I read the things I wanted to read, and I got more out of them than I ever got out of the stuff they taught me at school. The old penny dreadfuls were already going out when I was a kid, and I could barely remember them, but there was a regular line of boys, weeklies ones, some of which still exist. The Buffalo Bill stories have gone out, I think, and Nat Gold probably isn't read any longer. But Nick Carter and Sexton Blake seem to be still the same ever. The Gem and the Magnet, if I'm remembering right, starting about 1905. The Bop was still rather pie in those days, but Chums, which I thought must have started in about 1903, was splendid. Then there was an encyclopedia, I didn't remember its exact name, which was issued in a penny numbers. It never seemed quite worth buying, but a boy at school used to give away back numbers sometimes. If I now know the length of the Mississippi, or the difference between an octopus and a cuttlefish, or the exact composition of bell metal, that's where I learned it from, encyclopedias. Joe never read. He was one of those boys who can go through years of schooling and at the end of it are unable to read 10 lines consecutively. The sight of print made him feel sick. I've seen him pick up one of those numbers of Chums, read a paper or two, and then turn away with just the same movement of disgust as a horse when it smells stale hay. He tries to trick me out of reading, but Mother and Father, who had decided that I was the clever one, backed me up. They were proud that I showed a taste of book learning, as they called it, but it was typical of both of them that they were vaguely upset by my reading things like Chums and the Union Jack, thought that I ought to read something improving, but didn't know enough about books to be sure which books were improving. Finally, Mother got a hold of a second-hand copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs, which I didn't read, though the illusions weren't half bad. Illustrations, my apologies. Although the winter of 1905, I spent a penny on chums every week. All through winter of 1905, I spent a penny on chums each week. I was following up the serial story. Donovan the Dauntless was an explorer who was employed by an American millionaire to fetch incredible things from various corners of the earth. Sometimes it was diamonds the size of golf balls from the craters of volcanoes in Africa. Sometimes it was petrified mammoths' tusks from the frozen forests of Siberia. Sometimes it was buried Inca treasures from the lost cities of Peru. Donovan went on a new journey every week, and he always made good. My favorite place for reading was the loft behind the yard, except when Father was going out fresh sacks of grain in it. Was the quiet place in the house. I want to reread that. My favorite place for reading was the loft behind the yard, except when Father was getting out fresh sacks of grain in it. Getting out fresh sacks of grain. It was the quietest place in the house. There was huge piles of sacks to lie on, and sort of a plastery smell mixed up with the smell of sainfoin, and bunches of cobwebs in all the corners. And just over the place where I used to lie, there was a hole in the ceiling and a lath sticking out of the plaster. I can feel the feeling of it now. A winter day, just warm enough to lie still. I'm lying on my bed with chums open in front of me. A mouse runs up the side of the sack like a clockwork toy, then suddenly stops dead and watches me with his little eyes like a tiny jet beads. I'm 12 years old, but I'm Donovan the Dauntless, 2,000 miles up the Amazon. I've just pitched my tent, and the roots of the mysterious orchid that blooms once in 100 years are safe in the tin box under my camp bed. In the forests all around Hoppy Islands, who paints their teeth scarlet and skin white men alive, are beating their warm war drums. I'm watching the mouse, and the mouse is watching me, and I can smell the dust and sainfoin and the cool plastery smell, and I'm up the Amazon, and it's bliss, pure bliss. What a lovely... Oh yeah, I'm not reading the next chapter. It's like, all right, and thus ends the reading of Coming Up for Air by George Orwell. The next chapter is like 25 pages long, so we'll get into that next time, but hope you enjoyed it. Take it easy.